All right, we have quorum, so let's just go ahead and get started. We just finished our Goal 1 report before lunch, and this next section will be the Goal 2 report. I will go ahead and pass it on to staff to present.
You're gonna, oh, thank you. So, good afternoon, and before we get too far down the road with this, because this is our Caring Culture Goal report, this is again a look back at last year. And I want to thank Michelle Farrar, who's in the back, who was again the main person in my office who was shepherding this particular report and got us to the end point after several months of working on it. So again, the work session is in support of the school board vote, and we ask that you approve the report that was shared and is posted online. I'm going to just quickly run through sort of the intentions of the reporting for those who weren't with us in the morning. So the intention is it's used by the school board to inform policy and budgetary decisions. It also provides transparency for our community on the strategic plan and efforts to achieve the strategic aspirations and the associated costs for those efforts. And notice again that we're looking back and we're discussing last year, which was kind of an unusual year for us as a pandemic year. So in terms of the agenda, we just ran through quickly some of the background information. There is a great deal of additional information posted in the detailed narrative report for this goal. It's about 50 or 60 pages long, and that's on board docs, as well as a highlights document with the same scorecard as we saw earlier and that the school board has with them. Again, we'll be focusing on the key points that are listed on this slide. I'll start with talking about some linked school board actions. We'll go through the 3 accountability pieces that ORCE specifically worked on for the report in terms of the overview of our metric performance, the actions and associated costs, and then the conclusions about what we now know about performance and actions. Then we'll go ahead and I will turn it over to Dr. Boyd, who will be giving the goal champion response to those conclusions and focus on what we're doing this year. And then lastly, Dr. Brabrand will touch upon future considerations. So before we dive into the presentation, as we've mentioned this morning, prior to the COVID-19 closure, the school board, the superintendent, and the leadership team had begun the work of reviewing our strategic metrics and updating our focus for the strategic plan, and that work had to be stopped due to the pandemic. So this presentation again today focuses on what FCPS has referred to as the school year 2018-20 strategic focus. The Caring Culture Goal has 2 desired outcomes. They're listed on this slide. The first is our welcoming environment outcome, and the second is our healthy life choices outcome. As I did with the Goal 1 report this morning, here are the linkages to some of the school board decisions last year that supported this goal area. And these actions demonstrate the school board's commitment to establishing a caring and welcoming culture throughout FCPS, as well as supporting healthy life choices for our students. So now we're focusing on the slide that has a summary or overview of our performance. Looking at the highlights of the slide, it will discuss what we've achieved. First, we start off at the top with the aspirations. For example, under the welcoming environment outcome, we have students, families, and staff feeling respected and included, and all staff viewing student behavior through a culturally responsive lens. And then in terms of healthy life choices, if you move down to the 4th bullet, you see FCPS's aspirations that address healthy social emotional skills and behaviors, attendance behavior, and staff wellness. Now, the summary results for the metrics that were used this year for Caring Culture are shown in this table. And while 10 of the data metrics are unavailable or were unavailable from data last year, for example, mostly because the Fairfax County Youth Survey was not administered that year, so none of the metrics that were related to that particular data source were available, but also the state did not provide some of the historical attendance data that they had in the past. We had a lot of missing data for this particular metric, for this particular goal area. Now, I just shared that the majority of the metrics did not have available data last year. However, when possible, the narrative report presents data from other sources that were very similar or closely linked to the information that we typically gather for the goal reports. You'll see on this slide that this substitute information showed high percentages of students, teachers, and families felt respected last year. We had 88% of students, 95% of teachers, and 87% of families indicating they felt respected. And before we move too far from the substitute information that's listed here, I also want to add that some of the data that was available was somewhat questionable in terms of its validity and how it reflected the progress. For example, with students being out of schools for the majority of the school year, discipline referrals were way down. So our data that has to do with things like discipline referral is questionable how comparable it should be to what we have collected in the past. On the more negative side in terms of performance, we know from other reporting last year that students were affected by the pandemic and the virtual environment on many levels. For example, high school students in particular reported greater levels of stress compared to past years. And as we have seen every year, staff accessed and relied upon our employee assistance program resources at high rates, which was critical during the time of the pandemic and being out of the workplace. So we've now moved on to our next slide that shows us our actions and the related costs. The actions, again, were identified by a goal champion, so Dr. Boyd, as those things that were most critical to trying to support our work last year for our caring culture aspirations. Also listed on this slide are the FCPS operating costs. As I mentioned this morning, the costs represent our operating costs. The table shows whether the cost reflects staff time or materials and equipment. And I want to point out in particular the second action on the list, which has to do with the teacher referral tool pilot, where 16 of our schools used a consistent student discipline referral form, which we had not previously had available in FCPS. And the pilot at these schools, some in each of our 5 regions, allowed FCPS to refine the tool and its expected use prior to launching it division-wide this year. And in particular, the pilot schools provided valuable insight into the supports schools would need for consistent use. By systematizing the referral form, the division hopes to attain greater consistency in referrals and reduce disproportionality. Now on our second slide with costs, this has similar information, but for our Healthy Life Choices outcome. And you can see that many of the actions, such as the greater investment in drug use prevention and intervention, the supports for attendance and engagement, were specifically targeting stress and strains that surfaced during the largely virtual pandemic year last year. Both of the actions that I just mentioned were part of FCPS's expanded implementation of MTSS to support student wellness and behavior during the difficult year. So moving on to conclusions, as with our reporting about student success this morning, much of what is included in the narrative report was impacted by the COVID pandemic and the disruptions that it caused. For welcoming environment, we have limited metric data, but school year 2020-21 actions focused on staff and students providing support for a welcoming environment for schools. Likely, we will need new actions designed to address pandemic shifts in perceptions of respect and inclusion. The largely virtual school year context makes the low rates of discipline referrals and associated actions to support staff understanding of student behavior through a culturally responsive lens difficult to interpret. But some of the improvement was noted for all of our student groups. We'll need to see whether next year's data, which is this current school year's data, will help us understand whether that was a trend or whether that was just a one-year difference that we saw because of the COVID year. And then, as already described, new systemic teacher referral tool was piloted with the intention that all schools begin to use it, and more time will be needed to see if it improves that consistency in disciplinary actions and eliminates the disproportionality in student discipline referrals. On the Healthy Life Choices side, in terms of conclusions, Healthy Life Choices were probably never more important than they were last year, as students and staff face challenges such as stress and social isolation, economic instability, and other changes. Self-care, which reflects making healthy life choices, is foundational to student learning, and FCPS's work in supporting students' social and emotional learning was intended to shore up that foundation of self-care during a difficult time. Another conclusion has to do with the limited data and concerns about the comparability of the data we have from last year to other years. It makes it very hard for us to draw conclusions about current status or whether actions that were undertaken to support healthy life choices supported progress. However, a strong research basis indicates that FCPS's MTSS work should support desired progress as long as it is implemented with fidelity to the framework. This means that things like the supports for attendance and engagement should be continued even if we don't currently have data to show it helped us make progress. And continuing it also means the schools may need assistance to do MTSS well, and that the division should have a plan that allows it to support all schools across FCPS in implementing MTSS with fidelity. Lastly, FCPS staff continue to access the Employee Assistance Program at very high rates. This has been historically true for us, including the added counseling, stress management, and life balance resources that were made available during last year. So overall, the actions taken during school year 2020-21 serve as a good foundation for potential future increases on our metric data, even though we don't necessarily have accurate metric data based on last year's data sources. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Boyd for her Goal Champion response.
Thank you. As we think about our caring culture goal, we want to begin by sharing a few highlights of actions that were taken on last school year to really support our aspirations and goals. As you know, we spent much time developing and implementing systems that would support a safe return of our students to FCPS schools during the COVID-19 pandemic, of which we're still navigating, but we had much work to do on last year, and are happy about the results of those systems and supports. While they were fluid, they really enabled us to bring back students in person through that gradual process. We were also able to, with your support and collaboration of the community, to establish Regulation 2603, which really impacts how students feel about a welcoming environment, and also our restraint and seclusion policy, making sure that we're able to support students appropriately and ensure students are respected at all times. We also, on last year, implemented a consistent and division-wide designated time during the instructional day for social emotional learning through advisory periods and for morning meetings. So that really helps us to work on our goals about a caring culture or welcoming environment and student perceptions. We provided cultural and equity and continue to provide professional development for staff to foster culturally responsive teaching and a cultural responsive environment for students and staff. And last but not least, as shared earlier, we were able to pilot our universal discipline referral system, which we began implementing across the division on this year. As we talk a little bit more about what were some of the things that impacted each specific desired outcome within our caring culture goal, we did a couple of actions on last year that really helped us to make progress, or to, even though some of that was informal, as Leedy said, because we were not able to implement a number of the survey measures that we typically would have done, but things to support that action, some of which were highlighted on the highlight slide. So our gender expansive and transgender regulation, these were all actions that were done to help students and staff and families ensure that we are providing that culturally responsive environment. We provided de-escalation professional development for all of our staff. We revised the SR&R and continue to do so. We implemented the restraint and seclusion policy. We provide gender expansive and transgender professional development for staff, and again, the equity and culturally responsive professional development for staff. So as you'll notice, the work that we're doing not only impacts systems, but also impacts mindset that's going to be critically important as we look to make progress within our caring culture setting and environment. As we look at our second component, still focusing on the caring culture, we just want to share a snippet of what are the things that we're doing now to make progress. Last slide talked about things that we did last year, and we just want to provide you a preview of what we're doing this year. As shared previously, we're implementing a universal discipline referral system across our entire school division. We are providing targeted schools with professional development to reduce disproportionate discipline of students with disabilities and to reduce the use of physical restraint and seclusion in schools. And again, we continue to provide equity and culturally responsive professional development for staff. Looking at our second desired outcome within caring culture on healthy life choices, on last year, we provided the crisis hotline for students in the need of emotional support. We worked with an interdepartmental team to make sure we were supporting students' attendance needs, even during the virtual setting. We increased the number of schools that were able to make direct referrals. Previously, there were only a select number of schools who could make direct referrals to short-term behavioral health services. And as of last year, all high schools, all middle schools, and 5 of our elementary schools were able to make those short-term referrals. And we know that that impact regarding the pandemic and other pieces, that was critically important. And so we were really excited about that work and continue to work on that. And last but not least, we continue to make available the EAP, or Employee Assistance Program, because not only were our students impacted by the pandemic and other factors, but so too were our staff, and we need to support them so that they can support our students. So those were some of the things on last year, and again, as a preview, what are we doing relative to healthy life choices on this year? We have implemented a division-wide implementation of our social emotional learning screener, and we know that we'll continue to make adjustments, but that is some work that we're doing that we believe is critically important to helping to evolve in healthy life choices for our students. Our schools, as discussed earlier, have implemented and developed individualized wellness plans based on the needs of their school population via ESSER. And last but not least, that provide that targeted professional development to address behavior also impacts healthy life choices for our students. At this time, I'll turn over to Dr. Brabrand, the slide to talk about our future considerations.
Perfect timing, Dr. Boyd, on your part, as always. Yeah, just a couple of things before we go into discussion about that. Much like for academics, I simply want to say that the pandemic impact for our caring culture, and particularly for social emotional health of our kids, is not going to be something we're going to solve in 2 weeks or 2 months. We've all been through in different ways experiences from the pandemic that continue to have an impact on how we interact with one another, and certainly that's the case for our students. We do need to continue to see that social emotional skills are life skills. They are career skills, and we need to and must continue to teach these skills, because it's part of the portrait of a graduate that this board and the prior board, and frankly Virginia, the profile of a Virginia graduate, have endorsed for goal-directed resilient individuals, and we have to have that social-emotional foundation. So language matters. These are career skills that we need to continue to provide for kids. We are going to look at some of the things that we did in ESSER through our ESSER work this year and frankly next year. And I think for the next superintendent, what are the things that come out of our ESSER work that ultimately become ongoing and are not just one time? I want to also just mention to you as well, and we mentioned that the survey, that one of the things on the survey that we've asked about over time is this notion of respect, right? People want to feel included, welcomed, but do they feel respected? And that's something we need to continue to look at as we do our survey for our employees and for our students. And we know already that not all students feel that same level of respect. And that's why culturally responsive instruction, culturally responsive professional development, including the equity module that we did just last week with our staff, that work must continue as well. I also want to just say, and it was mentioned already, the behavioral issues, certainly during virtual, they were the numbers went way down. And year to date, our referrals for behavior are actually down compared to past years. What is true is that disproportionality still remains. So even if the number of referrals has shrunk, there's still the disproportionate nature of who's getting referred. So there's a positive that referrals are down, but the glow is that, but the grow is really continuing to look at disproportionality. I don't want to underestimate for you this discipline universal referral reporting tool. This large system, for this long, all the way back to Dan Domenech, had a target to look at discipline and found out that we did not have a universal data system, and we never, ever did anything about it. This was identified when I first got here. We had to go to IT and ask for it to be put on the IT list of, with a lot of other things. This is not to be underestimated, a foundational cultural difference. Universal referral form, same data, and I think it's going to transform how we as a leadership team and you all as a school board will be able to look at the data. I'm not proud to say it, but it's the truth, and this thing is long overdue, and it will help us, I think, on our journey for a more equitable approach to discipline. If we can go to the next slide, just a couple of reminders for future considerations with the budget. As I said already, we're working on the discipline work. The referral tool will help us, but we're going to need to continue to do professional development around how to be culturally responsive, not just in instruction, but in how we even do who gets referred in the first place. Who gets referred in the first place? We done a study a few years ago. When it actually gets to the administrator, the consistency of the consequence is pretty equitable. Like if you do the same thing, you get the same treatment. The difference is who gets referred to that administrator in the first place. That's where the disproportionality still remains. Certain kids are getting referred far more often into those administrative offices than others, and we have to do better around that. And then just finally around policy, I think we're going to continue to look at our policies. We did look at some grading policies last year. We have a universal no-zero approach now. That was not the case. It was determined by each school. And continuing to look at those policies to balance academics and healthy life choices. There is a healthy tension between that, and we're trying to get the balance right, and we need to continue to listen to our kids while also still providing high academic expectations for them too. So thank you, and we look forward to your questions and comments around Goal 2. Thanks.
All right, we'll go ahead and start with board comment. We first have Ms. Keys-Gamarro, followed by Mr. Frisch.
Thank you. Really appreciate this report. I think that this is a nice companion to talking about student success, because if we don't have the right culture, our children have a difficulty succeeding. I continue to beat the drum about telling our story and how this is important. I know that we're doing some work there already. But in general, just judging by some of the comments that this board has received, I'm not sure that the community understands the connection. And so I'd like to continue to work on that. Dr. Brabrand, thank you for your comments on discipline. As you know, a number of us have been focused from the day we stepped in this door on how to make sure that our students were supported and had an opportunity more for restoration as opposed to punishment. So I'm glad to hear about the universal, what did you call it? I'm sorry, I didn't write it down.
Universal referral form.
The universal referral form, and I would, at some point, would love to have more detail on how we're handling our discipline, what that means in our schools. I can tell you, as one at-large board member, I hear a number of staff members talking about the behavioral issues that have occurred since we've been back in our schools, how that has created tension, how perhaps they may be getting some messaging that they really shouldn't be referring people. So are there any comments that you guys would be aware of? Because I know that's, we're saying our numbers have gone down, and this is a look back, but, based on my conversations with people, some of our staff members seem to be very concerned about this.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I certainly think that we have encouraged staff to give grace, just as we allowed grace for staff as we came back from being predominantly virtual. So we've encouraged that. I'm pretty confident in saying that we've not articulated anything where we said you can't refer students, but just understanding that students have to get reacclimated. Some of our students that are in first grade and kindergarten, they have not been in structured environments. And so when we talk about, we have the booklet that talks about these are the things that you're supposed to do, but sometimes that has to be taught explicitly, and we can't assume that the same expectations in the home are the same expectations that we have in school. And so we have to be very explicit in giving students the opportunity to learn those expected behaviors. And then when they have missteps, like you said, what are things that we can do to help them with that without always being punitive or looking at out-of-school suspension options. I also think, to Dr. Brabrand's, or not think, but just based on our data, we do know and recognize that as we've returned to in-person learning this year, while the number of referrals have decreased, we're very transparent and honest that the intensity of referrals that we're receiving has increased. And so that leads us to saying and to looking at what supports we're providing students as it relates to our school social workers, our counselors, other adult supports, our social emotional learning. All of that is interconnected because we're seeing, for example, more instances of physical aggression for students versus some of the, we used to call them the D codes, the disruptive, disorderly, and we know those codes are different, but I know that that language is familiar. So that is ongoing work, and while we are excited to have the universal discipline referral system, as Dr. Brabrand shared, that's key, and we know that it's going to be key to doing that cultural proficiency work and the what are other options to address behavior in addition to having the systematic piece. It's the mindset piece that has to shift as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because where I'd like to go next is I think that there are some reports about where we are in terms of what the referrals have been. I don't know if I've missed it as an at-large member, but I certainly want those reports. I think that should be part of a work session. I want to look at what interventions are in place. I know there are some cases I'm aware of where I've been concerned about getting in there on the ground level as opposed to after the fact, where we could have prevented some things. And so I want to make sure that we as a board are aware of this process and aware of the progress and where we have problems and where we don't. I mean, board members need to know about that. So I hope moving forward, not next week, but at a convenient time, hopefully we can have a more in-depth conversation on how we're doing in this area, covering the entire county. I, as an at-large board member, would very much appreciate that. I also would like to just talk a little bit about the attendance and student engagement support. That should also be included. I am done. Thank you so much. But yeah, I'm not sure I'll need to go back. I'll wait, but thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say staff response.
Gamarra can repeat the question. I heard attendance, but the other piece it got cut off for me.
I wanted to get an explanation of what that means, and it should also be included in how we look at discipline. I also asked about whether there are reports available so that the board members, even prior to when we can have a work session, can get access to that.
Yes, we have semester 1 discipline reports that we can make sure, because I know we put a lot of information out, that we can share discipline reports per some board follow-on motions previously, that we can certainly push out again to make sure everybody gets that and can follow up with any additional discussions to help folks feel more comfortable and to delve into the data. And we know that those discussions are happening in increments also at the region level, and I know that there's a desire to have some continued conversations specifically at the region level relative to our discipline data and attendance data as well. So we're working towards that end.
So when will board members get it? The question wasn't answered.
Well-
All right. Go ahead.
The report, I think, is just a couple of weeks away to being completely done. I don't know if it's already been complete, Dr. Boyd, or not.
So the incident report for semester one, we included that in a Monday letter. But again, I know we threw a lot at you, and so we can push that out again. And then our police report, which is also another follow-on motion, that report was also included in the Monday letter. And there's one more report forthcoming in the upcoming letter regarding suspensions of 5 days or greater. In response to an infraction. But again, we know that that was a lot of data, so we can follow up.
You know what we can do, Dr. Boyd? We can talk to Ms. Tyler and go ahead and put in the Monday letter, because it's real time of having the work session. We can reissue those reports as well.
All right. Thank you. We'll have Mr. Frisch followed by Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. I think there's a lot to be proud of in this report, and I certainly want to thank everybody for their work that went into this. Can we look at slide 7? I want to call attention to the figures showing that 12% of students, which is roughly more than 21,000 students, who did not indicate that their teachers made them to feel safe and respected. And that is a large number. One question I have here, in the full report, I did not see any data that indicates this, but I don't see whether students feel like their classmates contribute to a respectful school environment where they feel accepted and like they belong. Do we ask that of our students?
I'm going to have to check for sure whether there's a source of information for that. I think this information that we have in here was not around that. This was pulled out of some of the ORSI the distance learning study, or the study of teaching and learning from last year, and I don't believe we asked them about how they felt about their fellow students, but we may have a data source typically in the youth survey that does, and I'd have to check into that.
All right. Going forward, I know we have said that there's a lack of sufficient data here, but going forward, that's an essential thing to be looking at. I also think that it's important that students get a neutral option for their answers rather than a binary of yes or no, because students may be picking one answer over another when they would much rather say that, you know, their fellow students or their teachers have neither made them feel more or less, and that's equally problematic. I ask this because in the last 48 hours, we've become aware of a number of Instagram accounts ostensibly hosted by FCPS students. And these accounts maliciously outed numerous LGBTQIA students and held other communities, including our Black students, up for ridicule. I believe the school division has been made aware of this, and that they're working on a response that makes sure that our LGBTQIA students understand that they're supported and that there are consequences for this type of behavior. Dr. Brabrand, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I did get a text, or I got information shared to me about inappropriate, profoundly inappropriate and abusive and hateful social media at Lake Braddock, and Dr. Ivy and Dr. Boyd and I will be following up with that school, and we'll determine if this is just school-related or something across the division that we need to lift up even more strongly. We have continued to say that we are a school system focused on non-discrimination. There is no discrimination that we will tolerate of any child for any reason. And so one of the things I know Dr. Presidio has talked about when we've done some of this previous goal reporting too is around digital citizenship. We just had a cabinet meeting earlier this week about cybersecurity, threats to cybersecurity for our systems, but really even talking more as far as the SR&R about cyberbullying. And that's what this is, through social media, kids being armed to bully, and it's not acceptable, and we are going to continue to look as a leadership team of what other things we can do to get the message out to kids clearly that we will not accept students to engage in cyberbullying or social media harassment or bullying of any kind. So thank you for bringing that up today.
I appreciate that. And it's clear from the work that was identified in the presentation that that's how our school division feels. I'm curious if we have sufficient data, or if we could have sufficient data in the future that would enable us to find where there are problems, if there are problems school by school. 12% may not seem like much, but if a big chunk of that 12% is coming from one region or one or two high schools, that could be a big problem.
I can speak to that somewhat. The Fairfax County Youth Survey data that we use for the metric data tends not to be shared school by school, but the schools do participate in other similar types of surveys, usually coming from the state, that do ask questions related to those kinds of things, and is typically presented back to the schools with the information that they've supplied. So sometimes it's not every single year, sometimes it's every other year, but the schools do get that kind of information from the state, from the students, and actually from teachers as well. So that kind of reporting is done at the school level. There's nothing that would prevent us from doing school level youth survey reports if that was something that was wanted. It's just not something that has historically been done.
I think the data could be helpful. I say that because it's not just this issue with Instagram. I've only been on the board for a little over 2 years, and we've heard stories about Black students who have been targeted at their schools, Asian students, Muslim students, Jewish students, and they're isolated incidents from school to school, but they do create a climate. There is no such thing as something being contained to a school anymore when it shows up on social media almost immediately, and every student and family sees it.
Thank you, Mr. Frisch. Dr. Anderson, followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you so much. Picking up a little bit from what Mr. Fish talked about on page 7, my questions around this 88% were about I'd like to know how many students actually engage in this survey. 88% of what percentage, essentially?
So I will look that up and let you know. It's going to be multiple grades of data, but I will double check exactly how many students were involved in that particular number.
Thank you. I raised that because I think it's important for us to be able to couch this information in its proper context, because if 88% of 10% of the students reported this, it really means something differently than 88% of 90% of our students. So thank you for bringing that up. It's unfortunate that we only have data for 3 of the 13 components, but I want to dive into the data that we do have. Before I do that, I had a question regarding, I think it's under healthy life choices. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7th one that we do not have data for, number of schools with low rates of students with frequent absences. Can you explain why we do not have that data piece? It appears to be that it's something that we collect.
So the data that you're speaking about in particular, the metric data has always been based on what the state identifies as schools with that kind of an issue. And so last year, Virginia did not provide or designate schools that way, and so we were not able to rely upon that. The report itself has substitute data or data that we know we had in the school division, but it won't be identical to the metric data that we typically use. So we do have attendance data included in the report. It's just not the metric data, which is why it's listed as missing.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to speak a little bit to all over this report. We have references to culturally responsive lens, culturally responsive instruction. I would like for someone to please make sure that we explain to our public and our parents and our students, what does that mean? If a teacher is being culturally responsive, not just in their interactions, but also during their instructional time, what should students and parents look for? What does that look like? If you can give us the 10-second version.
Well, I think the 10-second version is that we have classrooms that are inclusive of all of our students, where all of our students feel safe, respected, and included in the learning environment. And we have a framework for that. I don't necessarily need to get into all of the details with that, but it also talks about the types of instructional materials we use being representative of the multiple identities and cultures that students throughout FCPS in our schools and classrooms represent, as well as giving opportunities for students to have voice in the classroom. So the big nugget, I guess I would say, is making sure that our students feel safe, respected, and included in the learning environment.
Okay, thank you. I raised this as an important point because it's good for us to have context and for the community to have context in terms of why these continue to be the goals of the division. You talked about high school students. I think this is also on page 7, feeling greater levels of stress as compared to past years. Can you provide some specific data points? What was it before and what is it currently?
Let me look up those numbers and I will pull that and the number of students who answered the other question. So just give me a minute or so.
Sure. While you do that, I'll go on to my next question. On page 9, you talked about the EAP adjustments for a significant amount of dollars. Can you, and you're definitely right, our staff engaged in this pandemic just like everyone else and just like all of us handled it on the continuum. Can you speak a little bit more specifically in terms of what this investment entailed? What are some of the adjustments to the program that were made?
So
Marty,
Dr.
do you want to
Anderson,
talk
in
about
terms
the
of
EAP, or is Sean here? Okay, I see he's online.
He started, he just started.
yeah. So Dr. Anderson, in terms of the EAP, it's a benefit that we have continued to offer employees to support them and their families around healthy behaviors, including wellness and work-life balance. And so we did make some adjustments to the EAP during this reporting cycle relative to this report, where we did have to make some adjustments to the platform or the methodology that some of the counseling supports were provided. The provider had to shift from a model where there was some in-person support to one where there was availability and accessibility virtually on the platform for our employees and their immediate family members. We spent a great deal of time really pushing out information to our employees around how to access these benefits, and really focused on the fact that this is a very comprehensive suite of benefits that are available. So it's not just the counseling aspect of the work, but individuals can go and receive supports in a wide variety of different things that they may be navigating in their lives in terms of, perhaps finding childcare resources or finding services or resources to help with elder care. And a whole host of different things. Even wedding planning is a service that's available through the EAP. So it's about lifting off some of those weights from our staff so that they can, have that balance in life. So it's a very rich benefit, very low cost benefit. It's about $13 per employee to offer this service.
No, outside of the wedding planning, I think the rest are things that our folks really needed. So I appreciate that answer. My next question is, I think, to Dr. Brabrand. On page 18, you talked about budget considerations, greater resources to schools to support the connections between cultural responsiveness. Can you give a little bit more specificity in terms of what you mean here? I'm still a little unclear.
Yeah, I think we're still determining as we're going through. We purchased the SEL screener. We've screened our kids from 3rd grade through 12th grade, and now we're looking at the appropriate interventions to provide kids. As you know, we've got morning meeting in all of our elementary schools universally this year, and we have our advisory period in all of our middle and high schools. Never happened before to be universal every school. This may be some of what some, and Dr. Boyd, I know you may want to, and Deb Scott's here, some additional interventions that we will consider. We've built a lot of classroom materials to provide during that time period for morning meeting and advisory. There may be some additional professional development that we want to do so that teachers feel empowered to do that well. So those are some of the things right now. We have dollars to do some one-time training and some one-time materials, but do we want to come up with even some additional professional development materials? So Dr. Boyd or Ms. Scott, anything else you would add there?
The thing I would just add is that what we know is that we know that the needs of schools vary. And so we know that some school principals have reached out and said, we know we've been using CASEL as our framework, and we've looked at some commercial programs that schools want to access, and some principals have reached out and said, yes, give me the condensed list. I know that there's perhaps 100, but give me 5 based on these are my school's needs. What's going to be the support that's going to be the most appropriate? While other schools may want to do different activities, whether it's yoga, whether it's some of the mindfulness activities. So really just trying to work on an individual school by school basis so that we can have something that meets the needs that's also aligned with the CASEL standards so that we're using our resources.
Right, and I think you, Dr. Boyd, you and I had this discussion previously quite extensively, but I'm not concerned, but I'm confused as to how this is a future budget consideration, because what you've just described are all embedded in the current ESSER dollars, ESSER $3.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. That's your time.
Yeah, my quickest answer would be.
Right, but, I'm so
Yeah.
sorry.
They're gonna answer.
They could answer this question and the other questions that they were looking for data for, Ms. Omesh?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine. They'll answer
Lita,
those.
you want to do the data one, and then I'll take the budget one.
Yep, I can do that. So in terms of the number of students who participated in that survey and reported about respect, there were 14,469 students, and this covered all grades from grades 4 through 12 who participated in the survey. This was part of our distance learning study, and so we weren't surveying everybody who typically gets surveyed for the youth survey. And then in terms of the stress question that you asked, the prior levels, so that stress is on a scale of 1 to 10. Prior levels were 5.8, which is considered moderate. And then we had kind of 2 different time points. We measured it last year, and one was 7.3 and the other was 6.9, and those are considered, 7 is considered high. So they were moving from moderate at 5.8 to high right around 7 or a little above 7.
Thank you.
And on the budget one, just to quickly say, Orsi did this in both Goal 1 and Goal 2. We have ESSER dollars, they're one time. If we find things in the ESSER work that we believe we need to be ongoing, we need to identify those, and we just wanted it in the report to be on record that we're going to do that. What those are yet, I can't say, but I'm hopeful that Dr. Boyd, by the end of this year with schools, these Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, I need it for at least 20 of the 130 elementary schools. And if that is the case, and it would be an ongoing commitment, we'd want to reflect it in the budget. But we'll have that when we've gone through the rest of this year and reviewed school needs. Thanks.
All right. We have Ms. Corbett-Sanders, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, and thank you for this report. I think the timing is perfect because we will be working on the updates to the school, the Student Rights and Responsibilities document. And much of what's in this document today should inform changes to the SR&R. Something I have advocated for a long time is really beefing up the section on social media and online bullying. And so I would hope, I've sent this to you in the past, Dr. Brabrand, and I would hope that you're looking at doing just that. This document, though, really addresses 3 areas. 1, discipline. And I'm appreciative that after 5 months of requesting it, I was able to get the more detailed discipline data for our area. Because what that does is it allows us to inform the work that we're doing in individual schools. So I would ask that going forward, similar to how it was done in the past, that we would get a quarterly update and that it would be shared with the regional assistant superintendents so that that discussion can go in depth on how we need to deal with various issues in a region or in an individual school. In this document, you mention that there were some drug-free interventions that were done virtually over the past year during COVID, but that there was a question as to whether or not we needed them anymore. I would urge that online virtual social emotional supports for our students is something that we do not cut, that it is a way of meeting our kids where they're at and allows them to personalize what their needs are. So if somebody could address that.
I'll provide an introduction, but I'm sure Deb Scott can provide more elaboration. Certainly, while the students were virtual, that was our pathway to many of those students. And as Ms. Corbett-Sanders shared, and I know a number of other folks, Ms. Omesh has talked about TeleMental Health, I didn't forget, a number of different options that we would have a cadre of options, because that might be appropriate for Michelle, the virtual setting. But Sloan, you may really need to have Sloan face-to-face to make sure he's being safe as you have some of those discussions and dialogues and things of that nature. But I'll turn it over to Deb to give some more detailed option, but we do know that one size doesn't fit all.
And what we're doing right now is, I think there was a highlight of this short-term behavior health. And that is a program that we have partnered with the county for, I'm going to say 3 years, and I may be corrected on that, but about 3 years, and we have expanded that program. We're in conversation with them right now about how do we make sure that we have equitable access to that programming. That might include virtual, because many of our practitioners here have gone to virtual means, but what does that really mean? So trying to find a good balance of partners we have worked with and expanding that program with those guaranteed partners. I do know that there's interest in TeleMental Health. I would tell you there are a lot of options out there and there are a lot of price points out there. So we are not backing away from that, but we are really looking at who do we use in our county right now and what's our strong partnership. And our strong partnership is with our CSB partners in particular. This board was very forward-thinking with substance abuse and virtual meetings. That same idea can possibly expand, and that's what we're looking at right at this moment. So I think, and we also, the crisis text has been mentioned. That is not a new program. So just know that the board has been funding that for a number of years, and that is another county partnership. And I think I have said it, I am not from here, but I appreciate the One Fairfax framework, and I think that is strong, and we need to continue that.
So along those lines, I would just urge that we modify the text, which currently questions whether we need to do those things going forward. Similarly, we also had language in the policy piece on page 18 of this briefing, and some of you have heard me talk about this in the past, but one of the key policy pieces obviously is to realize the FCPS promise for all, and that means that we need to have a consistent policy that is implemented across the county on grading, and I would like to hear a little bit more details on where we are in trying to ensure that we have a consistent policy on grading.
Well, we did the no zeros last year. We brought those changes to the board last year of the things from the pandemic that we made several temporary changes, then we made some permanent ones. And so we can go over what we made permanent and what was temporary, with the board, or send that in a different, send that out on a Brand briefing.
The issue is that we have some schools at the high school level having a 50 to 100 in A, B, C, D, and we have others that are 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so when people choose their schools, they typically don't go and check that we have a difference in grading policies.
What I would say is we have a grading policy for Fairfax County Public Schools. Dr. Presidio can give a little bit more information, but we have a crosswalk between the schools that have wanted to look at a mastery learning process of 4.0, 3.0, 2.0, 1.0, and translates that into the 100-point grading scale. And we can provide more information about that. And Dr. Presidio can answer any other questions, but that's, we have a crosswalk for that.
But that isn't a one Fairfax approach. It's a crosswalk. I will need to go back. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Tolan.
Thank you. I'll start macro. Dr. Brabrand, I continue to convey my deep gratitude in your leadership on student discipline reform from the moment you arrived. And Ms. Keys-Gamarra, thank you for drawing attention to it today, because it has certainly been for me a 10-year journey on restorative justice practices in our system. And I'm really glad to hear that we're now going to have a database and a universal tool. It's all in how we continue. I would like to just offer that we give a lot of important focus on cultural competency, but I don't hear enough about trauma-informed care. And I would like for the consideration of Dr. Brabrand and your team to really start to build that more into our conversation, because too often, and Dr. Presidio, you know this has been an important focus for me as a social worker, the intersectionality of what we're talking about and our student needs. And too often we put them into singular buckets, and whether we're defining them solely by race or by poverty or by students with disabilities, we know that we have a number of students who actually carry a number of those different characteristics that impact them when they reach the classroom. And so when we're talking about having our staff be culturally responsive, I mean, trauma-informed care is so important to not actually make a biased response that by looking at the child, they're going to presume something about their culture, because we really need to understand that for children coming from difficult experiences, trauma experiences, and sometimes trauma extends for generations. That's an important part of that trauma-informed care. I will continue to emphasize again on the discipline piece that we know behavior is how children communicate, if their needs are being met or not met, if they are struggling, if they are suffering. And that's why, coming full circle, why restorative justice matters so much, is that too many times in this system, our children were crying out that they are struggling, and their behavior is the only way they know how to communicate that something's wrong. And then I will say, Dr. Brabrand, I think we really need a lot more information about how we're spending our professional development dollars in the report. Multiple times it was referencing the $3 million in cultural responsiveness and equity training, which I fully support, but it's really needs to be delineated far more clearly for the board and the public. It says things like $700 annual stipend to an equity lead. I have no problem with that, but we have 200 schools, and if it's a train-the-trainer program, I would like for someone to just walk me through a little bit more, because saying it's $127 per staff member, when you do a train-the-trainer, you can get to $3 million, but you
Ms.
can't get to.
McLaughlin.
I know. Always have it.
I let you go over 10 or so seconds.
I'm finishing my sentence. Thank you, Ms. Amish. So that's my question to staff that I would like answered, a little bit more clarity on how you came up with those numbers. And I think it's on page 14 of the report, and then again on page 19.
So all of the costs that are in there when it comes to staffing, or the staff part of it, has to do with how much time people invest. So frequently with professional development, it's capturing the investment of time that a staff member might be in a training. So if a training lasts for 2 hours and you're having all teachers and instructional staff at all our schools doing it, it's going to add up to a lot of investment of time that's quantified with the amount of money attached to what those 2 hours basically are costing the school division to have people participate in it. For the 2 things specifically about equity, it was 2 of the modules, and so one of the modules was done only with school-based, and I believe the second module was done with all staff in the school division, and so it's a considerable amount of money when you think about the large number of staff that would need to participate in it, even if they're only participating for a couple of hours.
Thank you. Ms. Tolan, followed by Ms. Marin.
I'm sorry, Ms. Amish.
We'll give you a go back. I'll put you on a go back.
That's fine. This is where you guys want to know when I get frustrated. That was a complete non-answer to how did it come to $3
No, I
million.
understand.
I could read a
understand that.
report, and that's not how you get to $3 million.
Do staff want to elaborate any further?
It's okay. I think what I'll do is I'll send an
We'll
email.
take a go back.
I'll send
Okay.
an email, and then we
That's
can
fine.
focus on the go
Thank you,
back.
Ms. McLaughlin. Ms. Tolan, followed by Ms. Marin.
Thank you. A couple of questions. I just noted on the, little scorecard, the caring culture column, there are a number of areas that just say not applicable, which, one I think is the Fairfax County Youth Survey, which I know our students took recently. So I'm just guessing that information was not available for this particular report. And same with the family engagement survey, for example. Can you just tell me, what the periodicity is of those? And then when would we see that those fitting into our caring culture metrics?
Right, so this is a look back at what happened last year, and last year we didn't have the family engagement survey done or the youth survey done. So all of those were not available for this. This year's data that was collected for youth survey and for family engagement would show up in next year's report, reporting on the data metrics about how we performed or how we functioned this year.
So we get it every other year?
The youth survey is every year. The family engagement has been every other year. Maybe Ms. Waltz could be specific, but I think we skipped a year because of the pandemic.
We did not administer the family engagement survey last year due to the pandemic, but we are administering that survey beginning next week. And so we're looking forward to collecting the data to compare to our baseline results from 2019.
Okay, so when will we get that? We'll see that. Sorry.
We anticipate having the data and the analyses done for late June, early July.
Great, thank you. I also, just thinking ahead to Thursday evening, we have on our consent agenda the restraint and seclusion changes to the policy there. And I know that, we've done so much work on that, over the last year or so. Do you want to just give us a couple quick highlights of what those changes are, moving forward with that policy?
Yes, and I will, I'm pulling from my memory, so I begin with a disclaimer that this is per Michelle's memory, so if I leave anything out, please forgive me. Generally speaking, our restraint and seclusion policy that's listed for consent agenda on later this week includes all of the safeguards and protections that were included in the original restraint and seclusion policy. We've just added a bit more clarity. So one of the things that we previously included no supine or prone restraints. We've extended that definition to prohibit any floor restraints at all. That's included in the updated policy or the draft policy for your consideration. Another change is that as you know, Burke School was previously not listed to be required to sunset or prohibit seclusion until the beginning of next year. In the draft policy, that has changed to this year, and in fact, they have been operating under a prohibition of seclusion since January 1st, but really have been working toward that end much prior to that. Another piece in the policy that is coming before you is some additional language regarding our private day schools. Those schools will no longer be able to, or we won't be able to engage in partnership with private day schools that would be utilizing floor restraints. And so we are working with our private day schools to talk with them about their willingness to shift their practices. Many of them have extended a desire and a commitment to do so, and we're hoping that some of those will be able to make that commitment effective next year, so that we will be able to consider any potential needed continued partnership and new placements. And we've also been partnering with the Community Service Board and CPMT to make them aware of that. And Deb can help me. I know there's some other things just in terms of student that are smaller things that were really already innately included, that we've made some more express language around, students not cleaning up any bodily fluids if they have any accidents. That was always the embedded intent, but we've included that very explicitly in writing. And so I believe those are the key things.
Yeah. Let me just say, Ms. Tolan, and then Ms. Scott, if you want to add something. The massive work of restraint and seclusion was done over 2 years ago with Dr. Boyd's leadership, with community engagement, with parent engagement, ACSD, SEPTA. What you're getting this coming Thursday are targeted tweaks, small but important tweaks, just like the private school. Hey, we've changed our practice. Now we're giving a message to private placement. You need to change yours as well if you want to do business with us. So we did the broad work already multiple years ago, but Dr. Boyd, with this view to continuous improvement, is going back through that policy and looking for where are the targeted areas where we can still go a little further. And I know, Ms. Scott, there may be a couple more details beyond what Dr. Boyd shared. Do you wanted to share?
No, she did actually get all of the high points, so thank you.
Great. No, thank you. I applaud all of that work. Good memory. It's your good memory. One other thing I wanted to mention, I know with my work with my Drainesville student leaders, both Langley High School and McLean High School have student groups that have been looking at ways to improve the culture at their school. And, I just can't say enough about, what these students are coming up with. So Dr. Boyd, you and I talked specifically about, some conversations recently at McLean, and just, another example that they had is, the students asked for, another flex time or another maybe half an hour during the week where they have time to do what they want to do. And they are looking maybe to have that as a reward for, something as simple as making sure there's not litter across their campus, because, they're just seeing people coming back after the pandemic, not as much respect for the property. And so, and maybe getting the custodians involved in determining, is the litter picked up this week or not? Do they get that, extra reward? So that's a very simple example. I just am hoping, and, maybe can get a little bit of comment, how can we engage our students even more, across the schools in investing, in their ideas and their, wherewithal on what to do to improve school culture?
That's a good question. I don't think I have one solution now, but I do think that I know we have a student advisory group. I won't try and call the acronym or the name because I'll forget. But making sure that even beyond representation there, trying to think of ways where we can access more voices. We know we work to have diverse representation there, but there may be some students who bring a different perspective. And so we'll just reflect on that and see. We might talk with our RAS to see what ideas they may have in us doing that moving forward.
Just a reminder, Ms. Tolan, we have SAC. That's the traditional student advisory group, 2 kids per school, 2 to 3 kids per school, that's been around for years. Just 2 years ago, we added the SEALs, the Student Equity Ambassadors, that really are about getting those other voices at the table. And we've had a group, I don't know if we have someone here who could speak. We have been working with the SEALs and hearing their voices to try to talk about not just school-specific actions, but also systematic changes that we can make. And if we don't have someone here who's worked with the SEALs directly this year, we can provide some additional updates. But we have tried to really get that additional student voice and then tell principals, we're not just asking you to name SEALs, you need to take this feedback and follow up and have it in your school improvement plan to drive improvement specifically around caring culture. So we are continuing to work on that. I don't know, Dr. Ivy, did you want to share anything on that?
I was just going to share that many principals have also created advisory groups, and they meet regularly with those groups, and the groups are representation of all students in the school. And so it's another way in which they can engage and get input.
Great, I appreciate that. And anytime, you know, Dreams was willing to share what we've got going on too, so happy to do that. Thanks.
All right, we have Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on the supporting part of caring culture, particularly for students. And where I see it, when we're talking about stress, is really there's three different things we seem to be trying to do. One is the academic piece, and someone raised about grading and homework, and that again is one of those policy areas where I really encourage our board to look at those things. As well as even the materials. I've been looking over our policies related to literacy and basal instruction, and those things have really been overdue for review. So putting again those things on our agenda so we can really look at those things. The literacy instruction again is so important to reduce stress because children who can't read obviously get frustrated, and then their behavior is communication. So again, this is all in line with building that caring culture. I think the numbers of APs, I've also been concerned when I hear 10th, 11th graders saying, that they're going to take 5 AP classes, that's a source of stress. And then the planning and professional development time for our staff and our students. So I think, so that's the academic portion I'm trying to just frame up around stress and what we could focus on. The next piece around social, emotional, and the non-academic pieces. So we've heard about some of the social, emotional stuff. I was over at Sunrise Valley Elementary last week to look at the Ruler program and how that's being implemented. It was an incredible place. I have a little video of it up on social media if you want to check it out. But just that research-based social, emotional approach and what that class feels like and that school feels like, it's a lovely place to be. I also want to continue pushing that our schools cannot do all of this, and we need to push to our other partner agencies and also inform our families. There's a lovely story I saw of one of our teachers who was teaching first graders how to tie their shoes, and how amazing. And on the one hand, I'm like, this is great, kids need to learn this. On the other hand, this teacher just came up with this lesson out of thin air because her students didn't know how to tie their shoes. So it's this constant tension of what are we providing, what do we have to provide, what can we really encourage families to provide, and I just want to keep looping back to that. But the final thing that I'll spend time talking about and advocating for is when it comes to caring culture and that supporting role, our spaces. And I will thank Ms. Tolan for informing me about the book Schools That Heal, which we then have encouraged our facilities department to look at and read. It features Marshall High School as one of the many examples, but bringing that healthy aspect to the school day. I feel like we all believe it, but how do we actually operationalize it? So it's the time in which Dr. Brayburn has talked about, for teachers to plan, but what about time for healthy eating, time for play? Our middle school students, they have no places outside to go and just chill. What would a nice space outside look like for a middle school or a high school student? What would some plants look like for that? Time for rest, the indoor space. We've talked about mindfulness and places, for people to pray or be mindful and just chill. I think that ties into this, and I'll just lastly say for our board, again, these are multifaceted things that we can really make really big changes on if we just think strategically about it. So, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, followed by Ms. Pekarsky.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate many of my colleagues' comments. I'll try not to repeat those because I agree. Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, for bringing up the trauma-informed piece of it. It's really important. I know it's something you've been championing for a while. Ms. Pekarsky and I actually have a forum topic pending on trauma-informed to really dig more into our policies and practices. So hopefully we will find time to hear that forum topic soon. And also to hear a little more about what our trauma-informed specialist has been doing since I think we hired one last year. So I wanted to put that out there. I did want to ask a little bit about the SEL screener and accessibility. And I don't just mean sort of accessibility, obviously hearing impaired, vision, but what are we doing to ensure that our students with disabilities who have comprehension issues truly understand the questions being asked? Because of course it's important to get a true assessment of their mental well-being as well. So that's my first question. What's the accessibility and accommodations being provided for any of our screeners?
And Deb, I'll let you talk through a little bit more, but I do want to say that I think that this year certainly provides us an opportunity to get feedback, right? This is our first year, and given the Panorama SEL screener and with all the glows, we know we will have grows, we'll have that feedback. And so Deb, I'll hand it to you to talk about any accessibility features and or what might be some things that any feedback we may have received from schools in terms of student access, if you have that information at this time. And Maria Genova is our SEL coordinator, and if there's any information that we can't provide today, we can certainly follow up.
I can say first and foremost, it is translated, so you do have the main languages, so a student can choose that as they take the screener. We also have a series of prompts that are advised by our vendor and through research that we can provide students with some interpretation of the words used in the questions. Of course, there are limits to that because you don't want to influence the answer. We have had feedback about what to do with our students with possibly more significant disabilities or more comprehension questions. I would need to get back to you on that about what we're looking at specifically in that, but we do know that we have room to grow with that screener and maybe look at other ways to assess social emotional learning. We have been very transparent that this screener is to inform not only student, but also to guide our Tier 1 practices. So it is kind of a twofold screener that we have started with.
I only bring this up because we tend to, I think, in my opinion, rely a lot on screeners or on universal type tools. And if people do not have equal access to these tools in terms of understanding what they're asking, it doesn't paint us a full picture. You know, and I will just tell you, as one parent of a child with significant communications issues who's in Cat A and some gen ed classes, his screener results were completely off from who he is. And I suspect he's probably not the only one. So I'm just putting that out there as something that I think is important, either as a grow as we figure out how to make this adaptable, or as something to keep in mind when we're reviewing the data.
And if I could, I just want to highlight one of the things that Ms. Sizemore-Heiser said, because I think it's so important, and I know if Maria were here, she would jump to the microphone and share it. I know that this is one of the formal new pieces that we have around SEL, but one of the things that we want to really continue to enforce and promote is that this is one piece of data and one point of time, and that is not the total puzzle for our students. And so we know that our 312 students gave self-reported data, and as you shared, Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, depending upon various variables, that might not be a true representation of who they are. And our K2 screener data is teacher perception. And so again, that's just for point in time what teachers or staff are seeing of children while they're with them. But just want to reiterate that this is just one piece of many pieces of data that we are encouraging schools and that we're looking at to determine what our Tier 1 supports and what targeted supports are needed.
Thank you. And I guess I will say one of the things that sort of surprised me, because we've talked about, you know, and Mr. Frisch brought up in terms of some of the social media and the bullying, and there's nothing mentioned in here about inclusion. There's nothing mentioned in the whole report about caring culture, not the report, but the presentation, I will say, about inclusion, about social inclusion, about the needs for addressing bullying of special needs students, which is, as data shows, higher than any other subgroup. So I may have missed it in the full report, and I apologize, but in the presentation or in the conversation, I just haven't heard it being brought up yet.
Yeah, and just a quick response, because I know I don't want to take up too much time. I think that goes back to the information that Dr. Presidio was sharing when he gave the high level of when we talk about being culturally responsive and have it culturally, that talks about inclusion, whether it's based on one's ability, one's race, gender, ethnicity, preference, all of those things are in. We want all students to feel valued, safe, and respected in schools. And so all of those things are inherently embedded, but we can make sure that we're more explicit about the work that we're doing in those realms moving forward.
Yeah, and that would be, that was actually, I don't know if you saw my sheet, but that was actually my next question was about the, about the, and I don't think anyone can read my chicken scratch, so, about the equity and cultural responsiveness PD, you know, are we intentionally including neurodiversity in there? Are we intentionally including, when we're talking about lessons for students, including that inclusion, that strengths focus around neurodiversity? Because I've just not always seen it, and I want to make sure, ask the question.
We continue to have work and grow in that area, and we'll continue to add that. And I don't know if our ECR folks want to add anything additional, but.
We do include neurodiversity in our cultural responsiveness training. And we are ensuring, again, that we're creating this environment through our professional development that is safe, welcoming, in which every student feels they belong and can achieve. So yes, the answer is yes. Thank you.
I would just encourage, as we're looking at these screeners, right, and putting out a screener, as we're looking at our school wellness plans, as we're looking at our personal, professional development and what we're doing for our students, that we use the word inclusion, we talk about inclusion, we make sure it's intentionally embedded in there as well. Because I know we all here want to make sure that happens, but I think it's important to have that intentionality when it's pushed down to the school level. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pekarsky?
Okay, thank you. So I think out of the pandemic, probably the biggest positive that will come out is the intentionality around social emotional health, around caring culture, and the work that our schools and staff have done has been really very incredible. And there's been stories throughout all our schools, and that's looked different. But at least when I've seen some of this data from our screener, it's obvious that the work is paying off in the way our students, excuse me, are feeling. So I think that's a positive that will hopefully continue on. Something that was brought up, the digital citizenship tied with the social media, gets me back to something years ago we had started to work on, and I believe put out some guidelines, which is kind of the cell phone policy in our schools. And I know then the pandemic hit, and I think all bets kind of have been off since then. But what do we do with kids now? Is it just open policy with cell phones in classrooms? Because I think that is tied, it is, to the social emotional health, to the bullying, to all these other pieces. Do we have guidelines? Are we, I guess, where are we? What are the expectations from schools?
Deb, do you want to share what information is currently included in our SRNR?
The SRNR is just pretty broad on that subject. However, there are guidelines, and I'm looking at Ms. Klemenko because she had that just the other day. We do have, I guess I could just say that we have given all levels guidance on how they may want to approach that in their school. There was a pretty robust conversation about whether specific pieces should go into the SRNR, and then some principals did react to that because in some cases, cell phones are used for learning activities. So, there's kind of a push and pull in every school about the use of cell phones and the having a child be able to access their cell phone during the school day.
I came late to this because I stepped away to put some trash. I just want to say, just a memory check for all of us. We did, pre-pandemic, we did guidelines for every level, elementary, middle, and high, on cell phones. Now, what we did not do, I don't think, and this was prior to Dr. Boyd, so I own this, we never put that in the SRNR. Here is the SRNR. We did give guidelines out right before the school year for all of those groups, and what I heard initially was it went pretty well. We may need to revisit it if you're hearing issues again.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think that guidance is being followed. And, I don't know that necessarily we need to put it into the SRNR. That's a whole nother conversation. But I do know that those things are tied to the social media, to the bullying, which is tied to it's just an endless, loop. So yes, I do think so. And I do think because of the pandemic and the over-reliance of technology, that has kind of been forgotten, and all of our students have one-to-one devices now, so they should not be using their cell phones for access in class. So I think that's important and part of the conversation that should come as part of these discussions. Could you speak a little bit to, there was a statement in there that policies that have implication on balance of healthy life choices and academics, and maybe talk to what, you talked about the no zero, but are there other things that you're thinking that could be helpful, since we're, Ms. Marin talks about us setting policy and being strategic.
I think that, as we think about healthy life choices and the stress, Leedy gave us some information about the increase for our high school students, but if my memory serves me correct, I believe that traditionally, our data has indicated as students get older, their stress levels reported were higher. So like our middle school stress was higher than our elementary school, our high school stress was, and so just looking at what manifestations that might have on any expectations or policies in terms of the levels of support, the workload that might increase as students get older, that might be adding to their stress, which is a manifestation of healthy life choices. We're still trying to seek solutions around that. Last year, we spent a lot of time as a leadership team talking about how we could support students. Our student representative, as you all recall, did a lot of leadership and gave us a lot of feedback in that realm. And we'll just still need to be reflective on that in terms of what regulation and or policy changes would be needed to support that. And I don't know if Dr. Presidio or any other staff have anything else to add at this time.
The only other thing I'd say, Ms. Pekarsky, again, I feel historian-esque in a moment. The prior board had a big policy question. There was a committee about capping AP or IB courses. Does the system decide the level of rigor that the kid ultimately takes, or does the system give kids the skill set to build the resilience and the executive functioning skills and the balancing to then choose the level of rigor best for them? That's really a health, and that is an important board conversation, and the prior board had some of it, then the pandemic came. One of the things, I think it's in, I don't know whether it's in your document or not, but Leedy gave me a few notes, and her language of saying it, student success and stress are sometimes countervailing forces, right? We want students to be successful. The system is all about it, but the stress level sometimes associated, and some stress is healthy, right? So it's really figuring out where we want to go ultimately in policy. Do we want to have it system directed, or do we want to try to stay more student directed, and then students are able to figure out what the right level of healthy stress is for them? And as of now, we've really shied away. The biggest thing we changed was the no zero policy. If you look at the history of the system, we still had some schools doing one thing, some schools doing another, and that's where we made a major permanent change after the pandemic. But the issue of how much stress for a kid is maybe still a conversation for the board to have.
Yeah, it is. And, that was system. And, I would argue, I guess, it's probably a balance of all those things that we need to teach our kids to be able to have those skills. But I do have one policy that we've done. It's not a policy, but one thing we could do immediately, research-based, to alleviate stress on our kids, and that's finally fix our middle school start times that we've talked about ad nauseum. Research-based, you sleep, you have less stress, you learn better.
Ms. Pekarsky. All right, next we have Ms. Derenak Kovacs.
Here, Ms. Pekarsky. I'm there with you. I think middle school start times are a huge issue. We've been talking about them, and I think what I believe Dr. Brabrand, the last time I know, I just read this the other day in some of my old files, 4.9 million it was to buy the 27 buses. I don't even know if we would need that, but I think that would be huge. But getting to today's topic at hand specifically, I do want to just say kudos for some of the things which are really are small things, but are very, very helpful to our students. Morning meetings, that is huge. The universal advisory periods, that is huge. And I don't even think I realized that we were doing that everywhere now, because my daughter, she was in one of the pilot schools with, one of the few that started these advisory periods. It was so impactful to her. And, I can't express how life-changing it was to have that one constant in your career, your high school career. And, she was one of those high personality A, high achiever, and but she loved the advisory period to be able to, and I think we've seen that so many. So I thank you for doing that. I want to piggyback on Ms. Corbett Sanders about the discipline data. If we don't know what's happening, we can't, as a board, work together with you in a team environment to figure out what's best is happening. I have to say, these things where we have to work in a bigger community, in a broader community. I mean, Skipped has addressed this. That was one of the original missions. I talked about one original mission was Skipped. This morning was pre-K, but the other one was stopping, the disproportionality. That's what Skipped first. So here we still are, unfortunately. But I see, again, thanking this team, as I did this morning, for what you're doing and looking at this. But we must get back to getting that as a board, these quarterly updates, Dr. Brabrand. Will we be able to do that?
I think we'll be able to do it. This was a pandemic piece. We had some staffing challenges. We'll work on getting that back.
Okay, because that's important. Ms. Corbett Sanders alerted me of, an event at one of her schools that we share, and it was not something we knew about, and it was a big deal, and the county wants to intervene, and this is not something, if we don't know about it and it's getting there, that's not productive for anyone. And the other thing that I was
It is your time, just so you know.
Oh, darn it. One more. Okay, so go back.
Okay, so I'll take my turn and then you'll lead us through go backs.
Yep.
All right, so thank you again to staff. I did want to ask, before finalizing this report, is it possible to use the SEL data we have to fill in for some of these missing pieces? I know we're pretty explicit about the source in the plan, but it might still be helpful.
I think I'm not totally following what you mean by use the SEL data to fill in the plan. The data that we have available is indicated.
Screener data, sorry, should have been explicit.
So the screener data is from this year rather than from last year, so we wouldn't necessarily use it to report on last year's metrics, but certainly staff are using it to help us understand where we are right now and make decisions for right now. But in the report, it wouldn't be possible to swap that because it's not for the
No,
same
that makes sense. I was thinking of VGA being a parallel in the student success, but okay, thank you. I second the piece on trauma-informed. I think that's really helpful. The Student Health Advisory Committee this year was charged with looking into anxiety. I think that's another thing, certainly as we move forward, to look at more specifically. But that will probably be for the strategic plan conversation we have about how we revise these metrics. So a lot of our discussion today just needs to be, mentioned in that meeting. I did want to ask about overlaps we see with ESOL special education. I know we've talked about this before, how there's like overdiagnosis potentially. Dr. Boyd, I don't know if you can speak to this a little bit, maybe to inform further conversation around metrics that we track.
In terms of the data that we have here, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about discipline, as that's a couple of the benchmarks, if you will, within the caring culture. We know in looking at our data that both students with disabilities and our English language learners are disproportionately impacted, and so we are looking at that data at a disaggregated way and looking to see what we need to do differently about that. And as you look at and I know we're going to provide you with some school-specific data, but even as you look at those division-level data points, you'll see that those groups are represented in all of the discipline reports that you'll receive for this year. And again, that's not new, so we're looking to see what we can do differently about that. So I know that's not a full answer, but as you're talking about parallels and how we look at those groups with academics, and if we look on the student support side in terms of discipline and things like that, those groups are both disproportionately impacted.
Yeah, no doubt. But I guess I'm also thinking of the situation where, a family, because a child in kindergarten comes in with an accent, they're diagnosed with some issue and they're, referred to screeners, but really it's a different problem.
Right, and I can pull some information and share with you the percent of our students with disabilities that are also English language learners and compare that to the percent.
It's 4%. I was just checking.
Thank you. See, there we go. And we have, and I don't know if Dr. Presidio has offhand, the percent of English language learners that are represented in our population, because then we begin to look at what are risk ratios.
17%.
So that would be that we
Say
don't
that
have a
again,
high
sorry?
risk.
17% of our student population receive English language development services.
And only if I recall the number, as you said, 4% of our students with disabilities are English language learners. So based on those data points, it doesn't appear, based on that data, that there's overrepresentation at the highest level.
There's still a question mark. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we do have a framework and protocols to assess students to make sure that we're really making sure that we're identifying what their language development needs are versus what their special education needs might be. So that's all part of the identification process when we consider a student for eligibility for special education services. And the ESOL team and the special ed team work very, very closely together to put that framework in place.
Yeah, no doubt. It's just, no, go ahead, whoever.
I was just going to add, Ms. Omesh, that as we look at our data, we know that there are certainly, in any case, there's always the exception to the rule, but as we try and look at disproportionality, there are certain formulas that we look at to determine, how is that group represented in the overall population versus the representation in that smaller group. So that's why I was asking about those two numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't look at percentage of SPED that's ESOL. I would look at the percentage of ESOL that's SPED, right? Because it should be comparable to the percentage of SPED in the broader population. Do we have that?
So I echo.
We can follow up with you just to make sure that we're giving you the correct data. I understand your point, though. I understand your question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just think that this has come up before as a possible overdiagnosis challenge, and no doubt we've got our standards, but on the ground, it doesn't necessarily reflect itself. So, okay. The other piece I wanted to mention, I know Dr. Williams had started some work, her and Mr. Armando Perry, just in terms of accountability around discrimination. I think this is building on Mr. Frisch's points. Certainly of ensuring that we look at, the cultural, the experience of students with their classmates as well. I don't know if we can pick up where we left off. I guess Dr. King had to leave, but, I would like for us to perhaps think of ways that the data informs that kind of work, which is ongoing and continues to be a source of challenge. So I don't know if that was carried any further in conversations, if that just died when she left.
We can pick it up from here. Dr. King had to leave, so unfortunately she's unable to be here. Thanks.
Okay, I mean, I think that that's essential and perhaps needs to come through forum or something, but to address these challenges, the disproportional nature of them. I also wanted to pick up a little bit of just the telemental health conversation that was going on earlier. Obviously, I'm a huge supporter, as Dr. Boyd pointed out. Ms. Scott, you mentioned looking at potential different price points, et cetera. Have we is there been thought around potentially putting out an RFP? I know I mentioned this last time, but where are we with that?
I would tell you that our team is looking at a request for information instead of a full RFP. I work very closely with procurement on that process, so that's what I believe we are hoping to do. That's less extensive than an RFP, but also gets us an idea of pricing, because it's very concerning for me when I get a question that I want to give you the best source possible, and these prices are very all over the place because it's depending on what you want. So to try to give you a good price is what we want to do.
There was a great Washington Post article on this just in the last week or two. It's exploded. Like, everybody wants this, but they also talked about the uneven, dramatically uneven quality is what you have really good? We can't come out with a FCPS promise on this and then deliver something that's going to be subpar. So that's just the challenge here. We need to do it. One thing Ms. Scott is doing that we've been talking about all the time, collaborate with our county first. What are our county resources that they could bring to bear, perhaps more? And then this next step, let's see what the marketplace is. Let's see what the costs are, so that when we bring you a budget proposal, we know we've got a reasonable cost, a reasonable product. We can kick the tires before we make too big of a promise, and then people go, this is not what I was signing up for. So we are focused on this because we know this mental health issue, as I said earlier when we started the Goal 2, it's not going to be a semester, it's not going to be a year, and we need a long-term strategy. And what we have right now, the resources we have aren't enough. So you're right on the spot with that.
Yeah, no, I look forward to seeing the follow-up on that, and then also the accountability for discrimination. And that's my time, so I'll take it. Go back. Go ahead, Mr. Nakova.
All right, starting with go backs, I'm just going to go down the line, and if you don't need one, just say not necessary. Ms. Keys-Gamarra. All right, Mr. Frisch. Dr. Anderson.
No, thank you.
All right, Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Very quick. Dr. Brabrand, you've been really good about explaining how social emotional learning is really an essential life skill. I think and I agree with you. I think that we need to do a better job, and I'm hoping that maybe you can come forward to this board with a plan on how to engage parents to help them better understand what social emotional learning is and what it is not, and that it is linked to those essential life skills and executive functioning skills. And so by doing that, I think we can better engage our community and take away some of the angst that people are feeling when they say, oh, we want your child to take this screener. They're like, no, I don't want you to do that. And instead, addressing that would be helpful.
Yeah, we can definitely look at that. I'll talk with Dr. Boyd and Helen Lloyd about what we can do, because this is going to be a continued conversation out of the pandemic. And that's what we're going to have to remember too, I think, as a school board and a school system. Even as some of these mitigation strategies that have signaled the pandemic come off, we still have kids running around inside with thoughts and emotions that are going to be with them for a long, long time to come. So we can't start to think that this focus doesn't need to stay with us, even if it's not in that same way expressed that it's been these last 2 years of the pandemic. So the communication actually now may be even more important than ever, because it may not be as obvious to people why this work still needs to happen.
Well, and I wouldn't link it purely to the pandemic, because the reality is we saw an upward trend on anxiety for our students that started probably 5, 6, 10 years ago, greatly attributed to increased usage of electronic devices. So re-pivoting or reframing that discussion to be something that is disaggregated from the pandemic, I think is going to be critical.
Might I add that we have a couple of questions on the family engagement survey that are new this year around that. So one is, I received enough information about what I can do at home to support my child with mental health and wellness. And then there are a couple of questions about transitions and how students are able to handle expected transitions within the school.
That's a good start. I think there's more to be done, but thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure, I just wanted to share that. I know it just scratches the surface for sure.
And so if we could get a better, maybe a future update on that area, I appreciate it. And that's it. Thank you.
Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you. A couple things. I want to echo what Dr. Anderson said earlier today on slide 7. Dr. Brabrand, it would be really helpful when we create these PowerPoint slides that are drawn from like a 60-page report, that we cite from what page in the report that's coming from. We always need to have the actual number the numerator and the denominator, so we understand what the percentage is being drawn from for context. I would also say on the report itself, just using page 18 as an example, it's really important that there be footnotes and citations, so that, we understand when you guys are going to say things in the report that we either understand. It happens in some parts, not in others, but like I looked at one area and I found a tiny bit more information in the appendix, but not much. But anytime something's being cited, we should know where to go look next, not just for the board, but the public. I do want to emphasize again, I really appreciate you and your team bringing us the depth of these goal reports. I feel like they are an absolute improvement during my tenure on the board, and finding them to becoming more and more meaningful. I'm always looking for more information. And then I struggle on how to say this, and I've got 30 seconds to say it as fast as I can. We are living in a time where our children are coming from homes where society is deeply divided along political lines. And I want to ensure, while I know our teachers are incredible professionals and they strive every day to do it, we've had some isolated incidents where children have come into the school and felt it is not inclusive, it is not safe, and they will not be respected if they share their perspectives on their own families' experiences or thoughts and beliefs. As long as we create an environment where those students know how to speak carefully and thoughtfully, I want to make sure we create a space for that kind of conversation.
Thank you. Ms. Tolan? Ms. Marin?
Yeah, I just want to add again, something I've been working on more and more, getting back to, is healthy food and how that propels students through the day. And students have been advocating, for it to be better as it's gotten worse, largely from supply issues during the pandemic and such. But, again, what can the board do in terms of policy, and what can the superintendent do in terms of operationalizing and tactical implementation? I think, we all have agreement of all these things that are needed, but how do we take a slice of something and then really drill down? It's very clear what is good food and what is not good food, what is healthy, what's not, what's fresh, what's not. So can we start with some of these more tangible things that will improve students' performance, and also show them that we're hearing them and we value them having some, good food in their bodies so they can learn?
Yeah, two things. One, real timely and real tactical. Right now, Congress is considering some budget extensions as part of continuing to fund government, and they are talking about cutting off at the knees our school lunch program effective June 30th for access to the free breakfast and lunches. That is too soon, not enough notice, and we need some help from our federal liaison to make that happen. That's just hot off the wire in the last 48 hours. I don't know that it's confirmed yet, but we absolutely need some calls to Congressman Conley, who we were on with 2 weeks ago, and Chairman Pekarsky was with us, to say absolutely not. The other one is, and maybe Mr. Smith, we can do this as a follow-up working with Ms. Burden, part of the issue right now with healthy food is supply chain disruption for some of the healthy food folks that we have, farm-to-table people we have, and they just can't get it here, or the demand is there's not enough. Now, we may need to bring you a more real-time update. What else can we do? And in absence of having that disrupted, we're having to fall back on some of the other food that maybe isn't some of that as healthy food that we would like. So we can work on putting something together for the Brand briefing, and perhaps even a further follow-up with the board. But supply chain is really an issue, and Maria's trying her best. But, and I got to be honest, as we're watching the events of the world right now, and I'm not trying to bring the world into this, but the Ukraine and Russia are huge producers of wheat and some of the other foundational food products. So I'm not here to tell you that we may have some additional supply disruptions and cost increases that we're going to have to look at, but I'll let you know between now and the budget in May.
Well, thanks for the update. I think, offering meals to everyone is really a double-edged sword. Of course, we want kids to eat. However, having kids eat really subpar, unhealthy food is not going to help those children to perform their best. Also, I know in my family, my kids are eating more of this food because it's being offered. And that's not a healthy thing either. That's not a healthy habit to say eat what's given to you all the time, and while you're, doing your schoolwork. So I would much rather say, get rid of the corn dogs and add more apples. What can we do in the short term? Or can we get rid of chocolate milk? I mean, I talked with this 5th grader, and the laundry list of things that he told me in my own kid's school, we've got to find some, we can't just say, well, it's supply, and, we can stop offering some of these horrible things. So that's what I'm looking for. What's the short term? What can we do? My first job I almost took at the Food Nutrition Service at USDA, and instead I worked at the U.S. Department of Ed. Those were the 2 jobs I was deciding. So for 20 years, I've been passionate about this. And there's a long history of why we get the subsidies for the food we do, why it's wheat, why it's dairy. So if we want to really lead, we got to think differently, and if we can make some short-term changes, because the kids are really... Ugh.
We can bring some updates to the board in the near term here. Thank you.
I next have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Thank you, and I could ask questions about this all day, but I won't. But as I'm listening to my colleagues and I'm listening to our staff, one thing that comes to my mind, and similar to what Ms. McLaughlin encouraged us to do, is sort of talk to each other about sort of the big picture coming out of this conversation. So I appreciate that framing. I almost think we as a board need to have a conversation about a whole child education policy, which working hand in hand with staff. We have a caring culture as goal too, but I almost think it needs to be rebranded, right? That a caring culture means a whole child education policy. We're looking at food, we're looking at mindfulness, inclusion and respect, SEL wellness, executive functioning, trauma-informed practices, family engagement. Those are just off the top of my head that I'm listing, right? And so I think as part of that strategic plan work, I think having the conversations with staff and getting ready for new superintendent, and just as this board of thinking, and I'm not tied to the title, but thinking forward, how do we take all of these pieces that I think are really wonderful ideas, and we all know are tied to academic outcomes and academic achievement, but also putting in a lens, what I'm hearing from many of my colleagues, of how do we tie this to post-secondary outcomes and post-secondary success, not just in-school academic outcomes, but how are students doing when they leave our school? So I just put that out there as something to think about as we're doing our strategic work. How do we do some strategic work around tying all these together into a policy, working hand in hand with our staff? So I welcome any comments or thoughts you all have on that, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, that's a fascinating idea, the whole child policy. Really, student success and caring culture. We did have the caring culture on staff too, but you're talking about it really with kids. And if you have both, and it may be really redefining student success to say, it may be moving it over to go student success is healthy academic achievement, but it's also all these other things, self-awareness, the resiliency. I think there's, again, this strategic plan is frankly now over 10 years old, and it needs a refresh. It was about to be refreshed by this board 2 weeks. I mean, I'm literally looking. I have to be honest today. It's March 8th. It's March 8th, and I'm trying not to go back for all kinds of reasons. Honestly, I have my grandfather was, and I'm just taking this moment to say, my grandfather was in World War II. He never spoke about it, and I didn't understand. But I have to say, there are moments now, I don't really even like thinking about parts of the last 2 years. I can Google things, and it has meetings we were in. I don't like to go back. I'm just being honest with all of you about it. And I think some of our kids are that way too. But this board, right before the pandemic, knew it was time to reset the strategic plan, and it absolutely has to be reset now as we're coming out of it, and we have our chance to put our focus back on how to do the strategic plan better. I think this work is good, and I appreciate what Ms. McLaughlin said. If you go back and look at strategic plans from 10 years ago to now, we've come a long way, but it is time to put a refresh and a more refined focus on what we want to accomplish for our kids and for the school division. So thanks.
Ms. Pekarsky. You still have 31 seconds.
Sorry, I promise I won't take all 31 seconds. But I agree with you, Dr. Braybrand. I think it's hard to look back, but I think sometimes looking now at the opportunities where I think some of these things that we've talked about have, the previous board talked about them, but I think for us has come sharply into focus as to what the needs are. And I think this is, I'm totally just like made this up, scribbled it as I'm listening, but I think there's great opportunity in the trauma of the last 2 years. So I appreciate working with my colleagues and our staff to sort of take advantage of that opportunity. You have 4 seconds left.
Thank you. Ms. Pekarsky.
Thank you. Happy to follow that, actually. And I would add moral citizenship, global citizenship, so many things really to think about around that. I just had 3 quick things. One, I think some of the work we did here was great in terms of expansion of the non-discrimination policy. I would like a commitment that we expand on that further, because I think as we become a more informed society, and this goes along holistic education too, there are additional needs and many areas where we have not advanced yet. So I don't know if Dr. Braybrand, you have.
No, I think we need to continue to do that. I sent you, by the way, I know Mr. Frisch and then some other board members about our incident today at the school. We've already followed up. We've communicated with the community. Part of this is just the vigilance of following up on what we say we're going to do. When we say we're not going to allow a environment where there's discrimination. I also just want to say, and I know you didn't reference it, but I am going to say one of the things we did too, I know just some months ago there was an issue at Fairfax High School around some of our students feeling respected, included, who were of Muslim faith. And we're working and reaching out. I was on a call just a few weeks ago with Dr. King, our Chief Equity Officer, and the Department of Justice with some restorative resources that they have that they're going to be willing to provide us for both that school and for our school system. So I'm really excited to share with you some of that work when we have it. So I think it's relooking at what we can do in the policy, but even more, what can we do day to day to just make sure that policy is fitting what people's experiences are. And what we've found so far is when there's a disconnect, and it's from all walks of the political spectrum too, does everybody come in and feel respected? Everybody, period. Not just one person, not another. Across the board, do people feel respected? And I think something maybe that we need to do in Fairfax and maybe across the state here is we need to redefine words to make sure we all, maybe there's more common ground than we think if we can redefine or bring people into the place. Some of these things we talk about I think are universal values, and we've got to reclaim them as educators, that these are good values for our kids and for our school system. Thanks.
Absolutely, no. And systemically, we have a role to play in what incentive and disincentive structures we put in place for what kind of conduct is acceptable. And then beyond that, as educators, this is a great opportunity for us to build the foundation, because people aren't comfortable with difference just because we say we're comfortable with difference. It takes a deep understanding of those things to sit with the discomfort and to relate to the other. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that area. The other thing is Mr. Chowdhury is a frequent proponent of MTSS in middle school. So I did want to elevate that. Dr. Boyd, I don't know if we've even looked into that. I don't know if what's happening in other in other school districts, et cetera. But is that something that we've had some conversation around?
MTSS at the middle school level?
Yeah.
So we have multi-tiered systems of support. That I know that Mr. Greenfelder's office works with designated school, but that's a process that we can certainly provide professional development to ensure that schools are utilizing that as a way to identify tiered interventions across the district as we're looking at our data. So that's not level specific because it's more of a process in terms of what are we providing universally to all kids proactively, whether it's related to academics or behavior or attendance, et cetera, versus the targeted tier 2 for some students and the very intensive tier 3 for a smaller number of students that aren't having success with that universal support provided to all.
And just to be clear, we're using the MTSS framework at elementary, middle, and high school, so all 3 levels.
Okay, but my understanding is it's not the same structure or procedure, right?
No, it's absolutely the same framework.
Okay.
And there's a strong evidence base about the strategies that we use. Now, we use different assessments at different grade levels, of course, right, in terms of identifying student needs. So that's, that's different across the grade levels, but the framework is the same.
Yeah, I think I'd want to probably just loop in Mr. Chowdhury maybe on Thursday to clarify further, but there seems to be something that's missing that he feels strongly is a student need, and that many students have come he's garnered the support of many students behind that. So I just wanted to put that out in the care and culture. And finally, I know some people touched on the grading policy in different ways. I just wanted to elevate it because in conversations with teachers, it seems like our good intention to have flexibility has led to almost a loophole where kids can not show up for, months and still pass or still have a C or a D in a class. So I'm flagging this because that's certainly not our goal. We had good intentions, but I think we need to revisit some of that. This is the reality on the ground that I've come to understand. So I don't know if you've heard this or if you have thoughts around it.
I think we would want to collect more information so we could have a more informed discussion of that. I mean, if you have specific schools where that's been an issue or a concern, I think it would be helpful to have that information so our region assistant superintendents and folks could have some conversations and collect some more information.
Okay, that's my time. Thanks.
Thank you. So my last comment was going to be asking Dr. Boyd or Dr. Presidio how we are engaging parents in this caring culture and how we know that students are watching, students learn by observing. We're talking about social media bullying. We're talking about bullying on lots of levels. And we can't do this alone. We are just the recipients of the children that come to our doors between, 8:50, 7:30, and 2 to 4 o'clock. But what are we doing to engage parents and parent groups? Because that has also, we have to be real, has become divisive, not just for this board, but for our culture in general, the polarization of opinions where you can't seem to find common ground. And I think if we don't look at that piece of the adults who are sending their children to our schools, so has there been any talk about that?
I'm not sure if our team from Family Engagement wants to share. I know they're here, and then we can certainly provide any additional information about how we engage families around a number of these topics as it relates to proactively addressing discipline and attendance and just how we value and respect one another. I know Mr. Frisch brought up a number of things earlier.
So we have a vast array of opportunities in which parents can participate. We have book studies, we have presentations for families new to Fairfax County. We have some opportunities to engage in mental health and wellness, and I think that's what you're speaking to right now around the bullying. But what does it look like for families? What does it look like for students? How can families be a resource and a support for their students? As you know, we have family liaisons in every one of our schools, and we're just thrilled to be able to provide that resource that serves as a connector between the school and the family. And many, many other things that we're doing to really build, we know families come with strengths and build on those strengths through a variety of means. So we have newsletters, we have News You Choose, lots and lots of different opportunities for families to engage.
And I do appreciate all of that, and thank you. I'm almost thinking, I think maybe because this is what I was thinking, something like this, because we were talking about the strategic plan and how that came to be. And one of the things we did is universally, region by region, we were doing it all together. We had parents groups, we had school board members standing out there with leadership members of the leadership team and saying, this is the day we're going to talk about how we want to reach our portrait of a graduate and how are we going to put our plan in place. And I almost feel like that as a community, we need to break this divisiveness that's out there. And if we could put something big and comprehensive, like this is what we need to do, because we are coming off of a pandemic that somehow became politically polarized. It has affected people on every level, and they're acting out in different ways. The things that Mr. Frisch talked about is one aspect. Ms. Corbett Sanders and I are experiencing some of that in our district, but what I really feel, if we cannot do this alone. We cannot be receiving children who are filled with maybe a lack of understanding about someone who's different than them is, because maybe they're not ever being taught that. So how, as a system, can we do that in that way? So just a thought. What? Is that a next step? That would be a big next step, but I do believe if you kind of look, those of you who are, oh, and Dr. Ivy wants to speak, just let me finish my thought and then I'll be done. But I believe if you looked at the way we strategized to get that strategic plan out there, there was a lot of community engagement, a lot of people came for a lot of meetings, and so
There was,
Dr. Ivy.
and I also can remember we did regional listening tours.
Yes.
And we all partnered together to meet and engage with the community. So that's something we certainly can think about as our team and collectively.
Right.
With the board.
That's exactly what I was speaking of. Thank you. All right. Ms. McLaughlin, you have one question?
I have a question for our chair. Dr. Brabrand, I'm so glad that you shared with the board about the federal government and the food program. But Chair Pekarsky, I would ask that before we necessarily go out and start lobbying one way or the other, I think this is a conversation the board needs to have with Dr. Brabrand, because I think there's some diverse perspective here about how we want to ensure the quality of our food, meet the needs of our children who most need these meals, and the model of giving it to everybody does have an impact on that. So I'm just a little uncomfortable that Dr. Brabrand, you would want us to go out and start to take out and lobby to our federal, partners, when I would need to learn more from you on why you want to go that route. I think that's something that's pretty important to just tell us.
Yeah, I can get you more information, and part of it is 3 months' notice to pull something is not the kind of operational impact for us to assess the budgets. We've had a set of conditions in place, but we'll be glad to get more information for the board to review.
And with that, this work session is adjourned on time, Ms. Omesh.